So they're talking about Ukraine. Let us recall that it is 2014 still. Um, it's is it October yet? Oh, it's still September 2014 here. Excuse me. And they're talking about Ukraine. Um, the press corps is confused by the policy. As usual, the press corps is always confused by the policy. Not because it's confusing, but because nobody bothers to explain anything to them. Um, and it's more or less the case that if they have any idea of what's actually going on, they're not allowed into the room. So they make sure the press corps doesn't understand what's going on, and then they don't explain anything to them, and then they ask questions because they're confused. And once they kind of start to get the idea, they get thrown out. Right? That's how this works. Um, they're not able to get their head around the idea of this tactic of providing just enough aid to prevent the Ukrainians from being destroyed. And the way Pretty Boy Josh is explaining it here, I saw some pictures of Pretty Boy Josh recently, actually, and his hair is uh, changed colors, or maybe he just stopped using dye. I don't know, but uh, he is less Pretty Boy Josh now and more older, distinguished gentleman Josh. But for now he's still Pretty Boy Josh, so we'll stick with that for now. Um, he's explaining that what the Ukrainians can't really put up a serious fight against the Russians. Um, of course, that explanation doesn't really hold up on a few levels. To begin with, we're not talking about the Ukrainian military versus the Russian military. If that was the case, it would indeed be a pretty quick fight. But that's just the point. The Russians wouldn't. It would be over in about 5 minutes. Like a serious war between Russia and Ukraine, it wouldn't take the Russians very long. You saw what happened in Crimea, right? Ukrainians didn't even try because they knew that and it was just the Russians just walked in and said, okay, this is ours now, and there wasn't anything anybody could do about it, right? And if the Russians really wanted to take over this area in the eastern part of the Ukraine, that's how it would be. There wouldn't be skirmishes on the outskirts of the cities. The Russians would not allow the Ukrainians to come in and blow up schools and kill their own civilians. So I mean, it's certainly true that if faced with a situation where you have the Ukrainian military facing off against the Russian military, that's not a fair fight, and there wouldn't really be a lot that the Americans could do in that situation besides get involved themselves or send the Germans in or something, right? But that's not what's happening there. What's happening there is that to be as generous as possible to the State Department is that you have Russian special forces just kind of messing around on the outskirts of the country. Could the Americans send in enough lethal aid to take out these terrorists, basically? Well, yeah, they could. That wouldn't be too much of a problem, in fact. So what's going on here? What is he trying to do? Well, he's clearly trying to obfuscate from the reality of the situation, right? He's feeding the media a line. It's one that doesn't really add up. Now, normally when you get the State Department or the White House feeding us these lines that don't really add up, we need to realize that their media covers designed. See, like I say, they send these journalists in, they don't know what's going on, and then they feed them trash, and they just repeat it because they don't know any better. And it's designed that way so that the stories are not particularly complex, so that people like me can look at the situation and be able to deconstruct it, because the United States still prides itself on being a democracy and having access to information and all that kind of stuff. And it's actually one of the things that I like about the United States. There are some things I like about the United States. One of the things I like about it is that when they lie to you, they don't expect you to believe them, right? Unless you're a journalist. What's really going on here? What's really going on here is that the Americans are trying to draw the Russians into Ukraine. And so they're not sending in really, they're not winning this fight on purpose, because they don't want to win the fight. They want to create a long, drawn-out conflict that saps the Russians of resources, kind of like what happened in Afghanistan in the 80s. And this is the idea and the intent. This is the whole point of creating a conflict in the Ukraine, is that it's designed to sap Russian resources, to get them bogged down there so that they don't have the ability to operate in other theaters, like, for example, Syria. If the Americans were to send in serious forces, then that would, let's say in theory that the Americans, that they dropped a bunch of Marines in Kiev. They sent some bombers in. They wouldn't have to actually use them. They just have to park them there. Now that might lead to a Russian buildup on the border. It might lead to escalations, but it would end all the hostilities. You can be sure of that. They might not withdraw very far, but they would withdraw. The borders would be sealed and tight and strong. And everybody knows that. You put that kind of weaponry in Ukraine, and the Russians have no choice but to back off. They don't want to start a world war. By not moving forces in, what they're doing is they're trying to coerce the Russians into the region, just into a quagmire that will just suck them dry. And to Putin's discredit, it worked for a little while. It was a couple of years after this. Well, not a couple of years, but time's moving slowly. Right? This is only 2 years ago. It actually wasn't that much later after this. The Russians did figure it out. But at this particular point, that is the answer to the question that the journalist cannot figure out. Is that they're doing it on purpose. They're not stepping in to protect the Ukrainians because they want to draw the Russians into a pointless, drawn out, contracted fight that nobody can win.